Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the things I've been musing on is this idea of a sabbatical for the soul, a sabbatical from our performance improvement plans or what we're up to in the world, when we've just had an emotional stack that has gotten us down in some way, the things that we're working with at a level of circumstance. So these musings have been prompted, of course, by my own recent experience, which has been that having some time of just being at home. I've picked up quilting as my latest creative hobby, along with many, many others that I have. But right now, sewing quilts has been really joyful and satisfying. And I am in a place where my dating ads aren't up, even though I'm not seeing anyone. And I've opted out of parties that are big group events. I've tended to keep my social calendar on the quiet side. And as many of you know, I absolutely adore travel, but my travel bug is really quiet right now. It feels really good to have this time freedom that goes with not having a lot of dynamic nature to how I'm moving through the world, to have a time with less stimulation, to watch some movies that are evocative and engaging, and to sew things, and to sleep as much as I need to sleep, and to have alone time, sitting in my hot tub by myself looking up at the stars. And I really think that I'm helped in the grace of this by knowing that it really is just a season. It really is just a moment of my experience wherein it's kind to allow myself some space before I get back into engaging more dynamically. And I just want to offer this and kind of unpack it. I think that other people's stories are going to be really different. I know people are dealing with health issues or loved ones that are going through health issues or economic challenges. And I think a lot of times we don't necessarily notice that we are getting depleted or that it's been a little bit much or that we need to fill the emotional bank until it gets to a more acute place. I know that's been true for most of my life, where I would neglect whatever version of rest or self-care I needed, and then there'd be some precipitating event that would involve a strong course correction. And what I'm noticing is I'm following the very genuine longing for what a Danish happiness researcher called hyggen, this coziness. He correlates the higher levels of happiness that the Danish experience to this concept of hyggen, which is this sort of value for deep connection to your inner circle and peaceful, unstimulated time. We don't really have an equivalent word in English, so there's a whole book kind of illuminating this cultural concept. And reading it, I could really find how, American culture is a lot about stimulation and stimulation. There's a lot of money that gets spent, so people have a vested interest in enticing us to pay for something that will be stimulating. And I'm not against capitalism, but we don't necessarily find the deliciousness of lack of stimulation. And so it's been this interesting dichotomy to be with a little more moodiness and some grief and some sadness, while also really having this deliciousness of unstructured time and being really present with my clients, but not having a lot of scheduled expectations, and getting to dive deeper into some projects like search engine optimization, which my engineering brain is geeking out on. So it's a interesting aspect to say, yeah, I am tired. And yes, my mood isn't super sunny. It's not a really sunny day in the landscape of my inner world. And yet there's something that feels really restorative and delicious about the maturity of my relationship to myself, which allows me to prioritize this. And you may be in a season where, there's not an option. You're keeping young children alive or have a particularly demanding job and things would be more complicated. But if this is something you need, even if it's not something that's fulfillable in the, next week or two, putting yourself on a course that gets you to being able to replenish before it's a crisis, I think is a really important sort of thing. So there may not be instant relief if the need's not acute, but you may want to make an appointment with yourself to sit down and really brainstorm the pivots you could make that would get you on a path to a life with a structure that would allow this. Because when it comes to the wire of a health crisis or a family emergency, things get figured out. There's a way that something that felt really impossible becomes available. It may be very expensive in terms of money or stress or what you have to make up later, but it can be a lot more elegant if you're, doing a little bit more forward thinking. So in the past several months, I had 3 romantic relationships that didn't go as I would have hoped or expected. And one of them was eyes wide open, ill-advised on my part. I've tended to make very discerning choices, but this was somebody where there was just a really high level of rapport and chemistry, and he chased me with great enthusiasm. And I, was saying to people as I was considering how I wanted to move with this, like, how on carnival rides they have you have to be this tall to ride this ride? I don't really have that for a height requirement, but there is a mental health requirement, and I think I'm pushing it on this one. So the upshot was I went forward into the exploration, and, he chased and chased and chased, and then, declared his incredible attraction and engagement, and then dropped the connection really hard and fast, and just was done overnight. And that was really hard. I get emotionally invested in people, especially when things get physical. And so that was an ouch. And then another fellow that I'd been seeing that I'd been enjoying, not super serious, as you may have gleaned from this, I tend toward the polyamory side of things, and really more solo poly. There's a lot of my relationship to me that works really well and that I'm engaged in. And so, had this other fellow that I was seeing, and he got back together with his ex-girlfriend and wanted to keep seeing me, but I felt like, this probably wasn't the best thing. I was engaging with him as a primary, and he was wanting to shift that. So I just said, let's take a hiatus, and kind of let the water settle. And then a third person, was just a friend that I'd known. We'd been involved in the past, left it on good terms, got back involved, was going really well. And then, he decided to end the relationship by ghosting me. I'm not sure of the semantics, if it's been a month since the first text they didn't reply to and a week and a half since the second text that they didn't reply to that asked for closure and clarification. Is it he ghosted me or is ghosting me? But there was just a lot of disappointment. I had thought more of his kindness and integrity, somebody who is older than I was. And, I felt like he would choose to end the relationship with a direct conversation rather than just stopping responding to my communication. I really, really hate when that happens. And I know that it's a price of admission to the whole dating thing that sometimes people handle things that way. And much as I don't like it, it is a reality, and I need to be able to restore myself, because a lot of people, men and women, end up, being so adverse to a difficult conversation or something that, might be emotionally complicated, that, they'll handle it with profound amounts of avoidance, which again, I find really painful. The one fellow I got to have a good closure conversation with, I came away feeling so much better about the connection, even as we stepped away. And on top of that, I've just had this really hard situation that's been going on for a couple of years now. As of May, it was a situation where I rent the place I live in and I rent out a condo that I own. And through all the COVID, the gal stopped paying rent, broke the lease in a number of ways, changing the locks, getting a dog on a no pets lease, just writing bad checks, like so much chaos. And the eviction protections finally expired. She'd used up absolutely all of the money available. And I did ultimately, luckily, get paid for the time that the government was covering. But the trouble was that when I gained the legal right to evict for non-payment, the courts were just so backed up. The lawyers were so backed up. So I'm 8 months into no rental income, paying all the expenses of the condo out of pocket, and I'm making it work, but there's such a psychological and emotional overhead to being in this situation that I just don't see a way out of until the courts can do their thing. It's been an any day now for like a month, and then there's another step after I get the eviction fully processed of needing to go through the lockout process. And so I've just been in this holding pattern of needing to hustle more to make up for the money that, I'm paying to basically cover my living expenses and someone else's, with very little hope that I'll ever recover the money, no more programs that would cover it. And just really, really disliking the situation and not seeing a way out of it. I wish I could tell you that, like, I have great shamanic skills, so I tracked a destiny path. I've done the back work to say, oh, I really see where I collapsed boundaries early on, that I, didn't want to go through the disappointment and the hassle of throwing her out because nothing she'd done was so bad to give her notice, back before COVID when, she was violating agreements and not following through on things. They weren't extreme, they were just numerous. And kind of that empathy, compassion getting in the way of what would really work for me in relationships. So I can see how I, made a mistake. I can see where it won't happen again. But, it's just something that's just been in my emotional stack. And one of the things that really meant a lot to me as a very emotionally intelligent response to this, and I just want to offer this because it really hit deep, and I think it's something that can be really helpful if you find someone who's just dealing with a hard circumstance. We have a lot of what's been referred to as toxic positivity or silver lining things. And I think our skill sets for just sort of hanging with someone in something hard and not trying to fix it or make it better just isn't something that is a real skill that we naturally get. It's kind of something we need to onboard and remind ourselves of. So I was posting in a fellow entrepreneurs group that I'm a part of about like how much this is on my mind and heart. And I shared that, I've worked a lot with it, and a lot of days I'm not filled with hopelessness or anger or sadness, but then I'll have a moment where it gets really big, and I'm going to share this so that, it maybe helps. And one of the pieces of feedback I got was just acknowledgement that it was hard and no fair and really sucked, and that there's an upper ceiling on how much we can use mindfulness to alleviate a very real human experience. So someone might be going through deep grief. They've had a loss, and there will be some number of people who, silver line it. Oh, well, they're in a better place, or, these kind of things. And there's just an upper limit. So for sure, all of my mindfulness, my work with the guides, my, health, the work that I've done in therapy has been really helpful in finding a way to do my life in the meantime while this circumstance that I haven't figured out how to get rid of without extreme measures. I don't want to say I had no choice. I certainly could have sold the property with a squatter, essentially a non-paying tenant, and somebody would have purchased it. I probably would have taken a loss. So it's not like, or I could have just stopped paying the bills anyway and it could have gone into foreclosure. Like, there certainly have been choices. I feel strongly about staying on the right side of the letter of the law. So proposals from people of sketchier approaches have not been something I've entertained. But there's an element of just, really being stuck with it, being better with mindfulness, but it just takes a toll, that this drain on my financial situation that I'm needing to manage, and frankly, just being stuck in a relationship that isn't working, that isn't mutual, that isn't honoring. I don't think it's personal. I believe this woman has a pretty severe drug addiction, and that in the chaos of COVID and, money coming in, she stepped away from her job to collect unemployment, things like that. It kind of took some of the structure away. So I don't think it's anything against me personally. It's just more that, when people get really messy, they don't have a lot of regard for the impact on other people. We're not super good as humans of seeing that and taking responsibility for it anyway. But it's this circumstance, and it's been this weight that I've been carrying and managing. It's kind of like you have credit card debt that you wish you didn't have, but it's managed debt. You have a way to work on paying it off. You have a plan. It takes time. It takes resources. And that's sort of like a version of emotional debt, of just having this on my plate. And as I said, it was just really meaningful to have somebody really get it and not tell me that there was some sort of mindset or practice or mental gymnastics that would make this okay, that it just is a life experience that's, been and continues to be really hard. And so the upshot of, some men who didn't participate in the way that I would have wished, and romantic disappointments of connections that I was really enjoying that didn't go forward, that turned out not to have duration associated with them. I'm not bitter or thinking like, oh, men are all terrible. But I'm also really aware that, like, having my dating ads up and meeting new people and having conversations and all the discernment is overhead. And what I'm really longing for right now is less stimulation and more simplicity. Travel's complicated. I love it, but there's a lot of visioning and planning and learning about, how you get from point A to point B, and, what the opportunities are, and, things like that. And, I obviously, my financial situation isn't where it will be once this, situation with the condos resolved. But at the same time, I just really love where I live, and it feels really good to have the non-complexity of being home with my cat, watching the world go by through beautiful windows, playing with the neighbor dogs, and creating and being present with my business that I really love, and just letting my emotional matrix kind of have a rest from certain kinds of stimulation. And I'm not depressed, and it isn't something that I expect will be that way forever, but there's sort of this low-level tiredness that is getting addressed and replenished. And I think this is one of the first times in my life that I've just had the grace and the patience with it, not to try to push the river. And, I have a sustainable financial situation. This is difficult, and there's credit card debt associated with it, but it's not I'm not going to be able to pay the rent or my bills or things like that. So I do have some luxury and some spaciousness. And of course, that speaks to privilege and gifts that I've had in the world, but also a lot of hard, thoughtful work that I've put in over a lot of years. So when we do a really good job of building a foundation for ourselves, it's nice to be able to sort of reap the dividends of that, which is that there may be times of hustle, but maybe we don't always have to hustle. Maybe there's some grace in these seasons where we're more tired. And part of what I'm working with is some of my ambitions and projects. I'm endlessly inspired by things that I want to share with the world. And I actually picked up a project and set it down. At some point I want to create the Energetically Sensitive Gal's Guide to Dating, because I feel like I have a lot to share about how to be in the game of opening yourself up to romantic possibility with really good discernment, without abandoning yourself, not having a miserable, depleting time of it where it's so awful you give up and then, swing the pendulum the other way and you're so lonely you make a choice that's not advised. I have hours of things to say on the subject to feel like I've really given people a very good map that would serve them well in navigating this. And I just put the project down because I realized I didn't have the bandwidth, but it's there. It can go on the back burner. I can cycle around to it, at some other time. But that willingness to give myself the grace to not be creating forward movement in goals of mine, and just to kind of do what I need to do to stay in a reasonable amount of self-care. So I'm looking to get enough exercise, not to really, expand my, muscle mass or lose a bunch of weight or, up level it. I'm in a good enough place and I'm looking to maintain that. So in this concept of a sabbatical, it's not a flinging up your hands and kind of letting your id run amok. Sometimes, I had a friend who, she was saying, I'm not happy with the weight I gained. I think I'm going to, get to a place where I want to address that because I've been in the I'm going through a breakup. I can eat whatever I want, which, we may have times of that when we're like, I'm just over structure. So I'm giving myself a hiatus from structure. But this sabbatical that I'm doing of just being a little bit more internal and less ambitious in the world and flowing with the season isn't one where I'm like writing myself a permission slip to, eat food that I know isn't going to make my body feel very, very good. It's a gentleness that says, let's maintain self-care at a good enough level. It doesn't have to be ambitious, but at the same time, how do I, just tend myself? And it's just been a really interesting moment to not be as sad about being depleted and tired and having some heaviness, because I've given myself the permission to have the downtime and the time freedom and the openness and the peace that I'm really craving, and having a deep trust in cycles and the restorative nature. So I'm in my late 40s now, and I like being in my late 40s because the sense of I'm in a cycle and I can hold my passion for travel and new experiences and new connections and all these really vibrant parts of life, and trust in the fullness of time that they'll cycle back around, that there'll be new experiences, that we're in a time of just an immense number of people, and know that very often in the online dating I meet someone I never would have encountered otherwise, and wow, what a neat human. And I have people that I've dated sometimes very briefly in the past who cycle back around and are interested in connecting again in a new and fresh way. I think part of what is resourcing to me in this time is having some very successful, sustainable, deep friendships. They're just a handful of really core people that I feel deeply connected to, even if we're not interacting every day, and a much wider array of people I love and adore and that are, part of the landscape of my world. I have a lot of those friends who, we might not talk in a year, but then it would be as if no time had passed when we were together. So it's just an interesting season. This particular episode may not resonate for everyone. If you're in a really acute place, this may not have the appeal of, how do you step out of this as quickly as possible? But it's a new area for me, as I've tended to be a little bit of an overachiever and always kind of have a performance improvement plan for myself, and to give myself some grace to just not have things go into a downward spiral. I don't want to have my lifestyle practices that really support feeling good in my body get worse, but I don't need to make them better right now. I don't need to, over function in my business so much that I'm trying to offset this. I can have it be a season where, I have some credit card debt, and, once this condo situation resolves, my economic situation will look really different. It'll be a boost instead of a drain. And, surely at some point it must end. It's been a really long time where I kept thinking I would get to the finish line. So allowing this cycle is really different. And for me, it's following that inner longing, that the longing really is for this spaciousness. When one of the relationships, the one I was the most invested in, ended because, the guy got back with his girlfriend and, still wanted to be involved with me, but not with the level of focus and engagement that I'd really been enjoying with him. I was really sitting with it, and there were some tears and some disappointment, and it kind of came out of the blue. I wasn't necessarily expecting it, but one of the interesting things is sometimes when we're connected to our guidance, we get that information that I seems logically like it would have felt like the rug pulled out from under us in a real shock, but actually it's like surprising but not shocking. And that was kind of my experience with it. So I think intuitively on some level I was aware even before, I had the actual experience, but in just sitting with it, really finding the part of me that likes being single. I long for depth and connection and something that's really engaged, but I also like being in a situation where I'm living alone with my cat an awful lot. There's so much of a dynamic nature to the level of engagement I have with the guides and the sensitivity and the intimacy with self that the non-complexity of having big blocks of time without other humans around is really, really supportive for my way of being in the world, and recognizing the complexity because I just don't find so many people who want to have depth and meaning, but not necessarily be all partnered up and on a relationship escalation path that ends in marriage and living together. So it's just interesting sometimes when we can say, well, I'm sorry not to have this, but I am getting to have this thing I deeply long for. And I've really felt how restorative it's been to have the time freedom and the space for that deep longing. And there's been a lot of what I've curated in my life that has allowed the infrastructure of it to support that. So younger me wouldn't have felt like I could let go of hustle and restore. It probably wasn't the best choice, but it certainly wasn't the choice I was making in my 30s, for example. But I just want to offer this in case it's a more subtle, nuanced map for a part of you that maybe is asking for something and not being heard, because I think there's so much elegance when we course correct, when we lie down when we're tired, when we replenish deep parts of ourselves that's more than just taking a few days off, when we allow ourselves to go more internal when we feel called, and more external as we feel drawn, and honor our own cycles, where I just don't think we hit as hard of a crisis point with that. And I think there's a lot of merit to that sustainability that gets created. So I hope that there was something here that supports you or gives you an insight or gives you the opportunity to be more connected and aware of your deep longings that maybe aren't the usual desires that you're most accustomed to wanting. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.